water was black. Not the kind of black you see in photographs or paintings, but the kind that swallows light, sound, hope. I stood on that cliff in northern Norway, January 1943, my breath freezing before it left my lips, and I watched 3 merchant ships die in less than 20 minutes. The explosions came first as flashes of orange against the darkness. Then the sound rolled across the fjord like thunder trapped in a bottle. By the time the screams reached me, carried on winds that could strip flesh from bone, the first ship was already gone. Just gone. As if the sea had opened its mouth and decided it was hungry. I was 24 years old. I thought I understood war. I thought I understood cold. I understood nothing. My name is Magnus Thorsen, and I died in 2005, an old man in a warm bed in Bergen, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew why I sometimes woke up screaming about ice. But in January 1943, I was young and stupid enough to believe that watching from a distance meant I was safe. That observation meant I wasn't really part of it. The Germans had taken Norway 3 years earlier, and those of us who remained free had become ghosts in our own country, hiding in the mountains and along the coast, watching their ships, counting their soldiers, sending messages south on radios that could get us all killed. They called us the coastal watchers. The Allies needed eyes on the convoy routes, and we were those eyes. Volunteers, most of us. Fishermen who knew every rock and current. Farmers' sons who could read weather in the color of the sky. A few former soldiers who'd escaped the surrender. We lived in stone huts and abandoned fishing cabins. Places the Germans had missed or didn't care about. We ate dried fish and whatever we could steal. We froze. God, how we froze. But we watched, and we reported, and we told ourselves it mattered. The convoys had been running for 2 years by then, these massive floating supply lines pushing through some of the worst water on Earth to reach Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Russians needed everything: tanks, planes, ammunition, food, medical supplies, fuel, everything. And the only way to get it there was to sail north around Norway, through the Barents Sea, where the darkness lasted 20 hours a day in winter, and the cold could kill you faster than bullets. The Germans knew this. They'd turned the Norwegian coast into a fortress, filled the fjords with submarines, stationed bombers on every airfield from Trondheim to Kirkenes. My job was simple: watch the sea, count the ships, note the times, the directions, the weather. If I saw German naval activity, I reported it. If I saw convoys, I reported them too, though carefully, because the Germans were listening to everything. We had codes, frequencies that changed every week, times that shifted. Messages had to be short, cryptic. Grandmother arrived safely might mean a convoy of 15 ships had passed. Uncle is ill could mean U-boats were hunting. I'd been at my post for 6 months when it happened. The post was a shepherd's hut halfway up a cliff face on the island of Soroya, north of Hammerfest. The nearest village was 8 kilometers away, and I hadn't seen another human being in 3 weeks. I had a radio, a pair of binoculars that the resistance had stolen from a German officer, a rifle with 6 bullets, and enough dried cod to last until March. The hut was stone, about 3 meters square, with a roof that leaked and a door that didn't quite close. I slept in my clothes, wrapped in every blanket I owned, and still woke up with ice in my beard. January 10th, 1943. The wind had been building for 2 days, coming down from the north like something alive and angry. The temperature had dropped to maybe 20 below, maybe colder. Hard to tell after a certain point. Cold stops being a number and becomes a presence, a weight that presses down on everything. The sea was running heavy, waves that looked like moving mountains even from my height. Not convoy weather. Nobody sane would be out there, but they were out there. I heard them before I saw them, the deep throb of engines fighting through heavy seas. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon, though afternoon meant nothing that far north in January. The sky was the color of old bruises, that twilight that passes for daylight in the Arctic winter. I grabbed the binoculars and went to the edge of the cliff where the wind tried to knock me flat. 6 ships, no, 7, spread out across maybe 3 kilometers of ocean, laboring through seas that broke over their bows and turned to ice before the water could drain away. Merchant ships, most of them, the kind of rusty freighters that looked old when they were new. 2 of them were flying British flags. 1 had American markings. The others were too far away or too covered in ice for me to tell. No escorts that I could see, which was wrong. Convoys always had escorts. Destroyers, corvettes, something. These ships were alone and they were dying slow. I should have reported them immediately. That was the protocol. But something made me wait, made me watch. Maybe it was the way they moved, these massive steel boxes being tossed around like toys. Maybe it was knowing what was out there, under that black water waiting. The U-boats hunted in packs in these waters. Everyone knew it. The Germans called it a turkey shoot. The first torpedo hit at 14:47. I know because I checked my watch after, needed to record the time for the report. The explosion lifted the stern of the third ship in line completely out of the water. For just a moment I could see the propeller spinning in empty air, could see the whole rudder assembly, and then the ship broke in half, just snapped. The bow section kept moving forward for maybe 30 seconds, pushed by momentum and the weight of whatever cargo was in the holds, and then it rolled to port and went down. The stern section had already disappeared. 90 seconds from explosion to gone. I timed that too. The other ships scattered, or tried to. You can't really scatter in seas like that. Can't maneuver, can't do anything but try to keep your bow into the waves and pray. I saw the signal lamps flashing between them, frantic Morse that I was too far away to read. Two of the ships started making smoke, these thick black clouds that the wind shredded before they could form any real concealment. It didn't matter. The U-boats had the range now, had the scent. The second ship died at 14:52. A tanker this time, and when the torpedo hit, the whole ocean caught fire. I don't know what she was carrying, diesel maybe, or aviation fuel, but it spread across the water like a living thing. Yellow and orange flames that turned the waves into a sea of fire. The ship burned for maybe 4 minutes before the flames found something that exploded, and then there was just a column of smoke and burning debris falling back into the water like black snow. I should have been on the radio. Should have been sending the warning, the coordinates, something. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I'd seen death before. Norway had been occupied for 3 years. I'd seen friends arrested, shot. I'd seen hunger and fear and all the small cruelties of occupation. But I'd never seen industrial death, the kind that comes with mathematics and planning and cold efficiency. This wasn't murder. This was hunting. The third ship tried to run. A big cargo vessel, maybe 8,000 tons, and she turned south and opened up her engines, black smoke pouring from her stack as she ran for the coast, for shallow water where submarines couldn't follow. She almost made it. I was actually starting to believe she might make it. And then I saw the wake, this straight white line cutting through the dark water faster than anything that size should move. And I knew. The torpedo hit just behind the bridge. The explosion was smaller this time, more controlled, and for a moment I thought maybe the ship would survive it. She kept moving, kept her heading, and I could see crew on deck, tiny figures scrambling to launch boats. But then she started to list, slow at first, then faster, and I realized the cargo must have shifted, thousands of tons of whatever she was carrying sliding to one side. She went over in less than 3 minutes, rolled completely, and I saw men in the water, saw them waving, and then she went down and took them all with her. 3 ships, 11 minutes. The other 4 were still out there, still running, and I finally managed to move, managed to get to the radio. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the dials. The codes felt stupid now, meaningless. Grandmother is dying. The garden is on fire. These little pretend phrases while men burned and drowned. But I sent them anyway. Sent the position, the heading, the count of ships still afloat. Sent it 3 times to make sure it got through, and then I sat there with the headphones on, listening to static, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. When I looked back at the sea, one of the remaining ships was stopped dead in the water, listing heavily to starboard. I don't know if she'd been hit or if the engines had just failed, but she wasn't moving, and that meant she was already dead. The other 3 were still running south, strung out now, each captain making his own choice about speed versus fuel versus the chance of running aground in the dark. I watched them until they disappeared into the coastal shadows, and then I watched the stopped ship die. She took 40 minutes. No more torpedoes, no more explosions, just the slow mathematics of flooding and list and the way steel behaves when it's cold and stressed and full of seawater. She went over at 15:43, rolled completely, and floated upside down for another 10 minutes before the air trapped inside finally escaped and she slipped under. I could see lifeboats, 2 of them, pulling away from the wreck, small orange dots on that black water already being scattered by the wind and current. The nearest land was maybe 5 kilometers south, and the water temperature was probably right around freezing. In those conditions, in January in the Arctic, even if they reached shore, they'd die of hypothermia within hours unless they found shelter. I tried calling it in, tried to give their position, their heading, The radio crackled back static and what might have been Morse but was probably just interference from the storm. I tried for 20 minutes and then I stopped because the battery was running low and I had to save power for the regular scheduled contact. The sun set at 16:12. Not that there'd been much sun to begin with, but what little twilight we had faded into full dark, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. I could hear the wind howling around the hut, could hear ice forming on the stones. I sat in the dark with one blanket wrapped around me and tried not to think about those lifeboats, about men rowing through 20-foot seas in darkness so complete you couldn't see your own hands, about the cold soaking through wool and cotton and skin until it reached the bone. I joined the resistance because it seemed like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. The Germans had taken our country, and we were supposed to just accept it, live under their rules, speak when spoken to, pretend we didn't see the ships in our harbors and the troops on our roads. My father had fought in 1940, had been captured and sent to a prison camp in Germany where he died of pneumonia in the winter of '41. My mother and sister had evacuated to Sweden. I'd stayed because someone had to stay. Someone had to resist. Someone had to tell the Allies what was happening in our waters. Noble thoughts, brave thoughts, the kind of thoughts that keep you warm at night when you're 19 years old and stupid. At 24, freezing in a stone hut while men drowned 5 kilometers away, those thoughts felt thin and small and useless. I must have slept, though I don't remember deciding to. When I woke up, it was still dark. It would be dark for another 8 hours, and the wind had died down to a dull roar. The radio was beeping. Incoming message. I fumbled for the headphones, tried to clear the ice from my eyes, worked the decoder with fingers that felt like frozen wood. Observer post 7. Acknowledge report received. Stop convoy. Scattered. Stop. Continue surveillance. Stop. That was it. That was all. Continue surveillance. As if I could do anything else. As if there was anything to see now except empty water and wreckage, and maybe bodies if they floated. I sent back acknowledgement, turned off the radio to save the battery and sat in the dark listening to my own breathing. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn, I went back to the cliff edge and looked south along the coast. The weather had cleared slightly, the wind down to maybe 30 knots. The seas still heavy, but not the monsters they'd been. I could see wreckage, debris scattered across kilometers of water. A lifeboat capsized, rolling in the swells. What might have been a body, but was probably just part of a ship's superstructure. The black oil slick from the tanker had mostly dispersed, but you could still see the sheen of it on the waves, catching what little light there was. No ships, no survivors. Nothing but the sea and the cold and the absolutely certainty that somewhere out there, under that black water, the U-boats were still hunting, still waiting for the next convoy, the next target, the next batch of men who thought they could cross this ocean and survive. I stayed at that post for another 6 weeks before the resistance rotated me out, watched 17 more convoys pass through those waters, saw 4 more ships go down, including a destroyer that a U-boat caught in the pre-dawn darkness off Nordkapp, sent my reports, got my acknowledgements, ate my dried fish, and told myself it mattered, that the intelligence was valuable, that every ship I counted and reported was a life I was helping to save. Maybe it was true. Maybe it mattered. But on January 10th, 1943, watching those 3 ships break apart and sink, watching men die in water so cold it stopped your heart before you could drown, I learned something that stayed with me for the rest of my life, that woke me up sweating even 60 years later in that comfortable bed in Bergen. The ocean doesn't care about sides. It doesn't care about right or wrong, about allies or axis, about the reasons we tell ourselves for why men should die in the service of nations and ideals. The ocean just takes what it wants, and on that day in January, in the waters off northern Norway, it wanted everything. The sea swallowed those ships, those men, swallowed them whole and kept moving, kept rolling, kept being the same endless black presence it had always been. And I watched. That was my job, my duty, my small contribution to the war. I watched, and I reported, and I survived. 3 things those men in the water didn't get to do. Sometimes I wonder if they screamed my name. If in those last minutes treading water in the dark, feeling the cold squeeze their hearts, they looked up at the cliffs and wondered if anyone was watching, if anyone saw, if anyone cared. I want to believe I would have heard them. I want to believe the wind would have carried their voices up to me. But the wind doesn't carry voices up. It carries them away, out to sea, to places no one will ever hear them. I'm 96 years old now, telling this story to a granddaughter who thinks war is something that happens in movies and history books. She's asked me to write it down, to record it, to make sure someone remembers. So I'm remembering. I'm going back to that frozen cliff in Norway, to that moment when the sea opened up and took 3 ships and hundreds of men, and didn't even pause to notice what it had done. This is what I want her to know. What I want anyone who hears this to know. The Arctic convoys were necessary. They were vital. They helped win the war, helped keep the Soviet Union in the fight, helped turn the tide against Germany, and they cost lives measured in thousands, cost them in the coldest, darkest, most brutal waters on Earth. Every convoy that made it through was a miracle. Every ship that sank was a tragedy, and people like me watched from the shore, safe and cold and useless, and called it service. The Germans surrendered in May 1945. Norway was free again, though it didn't feel like freedom for a long time. Too much had changed, too much had been lost. I came down from the mountains, went back to Bergen, found work on the docks, married a girl who'd been in the resistance too, who understood why I sometimes woke up gasping. We had children, grandchildren. I lived a long, mostly good life. I survived, but I never forgot those 3 ships breaking apart in the darkness. Never forgot the sound of the explosions rolling across the water. Never forgot the orange glow of burning fuel and the tiny orange dots of lifeboats rowing through impossible seas toward a shore they'd never reach. The ocean took sides that day. It sided with the cold and the dark and the absolute indifference of nature to human struggle. It reminded us that for all our ships and weapons and grand strategies, we were just meat and blood and hope doesn't float when the water's cold enough to stop your heart. I saw the sea swallow ships and I saw it happen again and again, and I learned that witnessing doesn't make you innocent. It just makes you the one who has to remember, the one who has to carry the weight of what happened, the one who has to tell the story long after everyone else is gone. So I'm telling it. This is what I saw. This is what I remember. This is what the ocean did on a winter day in 1943 off the coast of Norway, when the cold and the dark and the submarines turned the sea into a graveyard, and I watched from the cliffs and did nothing because there was nothing to do except watch and report and survive to tell about it. Remember them, the men on those ships, the ones who went down with their vessels and the ones who made it to lifeboats only to freeze in the darkness, the engineers who kept the engines running until the water reached the boilers, the radio men who sent distress signals until the power died, the captains who stayed on their bridges until the ships rolled over, the young sailors who'd never seen snow before they shipped out to the Arctic, never imagined they'd die in water so cold it felt like burning. Remember that for every ship that made it through, for every convoy that delivered its cargo to Murmansk, there were ships that didn't make it, convoys that were scattered and destroyed, men who died so far from home that their families never got to bury them, never got anything except telegrams and medals and the cold comfort of knowing their sacrifice mattered. It mattered. That's what I told myself then, what I tell myself now. It had to matter. Because if it didn't, if those deaths meant nothing, then what was I doing on that cliff? What were any of us doing? What was the point of freezing and starving and watching men die if it didn't somehow, someway make a difference? I want to believe it did. I need to believe it did. But belief doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't warm the cold, doesn't make the ocean any less black or the wind any less brutal or the memory any easier to carry. This is my story, or part of it, the part I can tell. There are other parts, other days, other ships. But January 10th, 1943, that's the one that stayed with me, that came back in dreams and flashbacks and moments of sudden clarity when I'd be doing something completely ordinary, shopping, walking, playing with my grandchildren, and suddenly I'd be back on that cliff watching fire spread across black water, listening to metal scream as it tore itself apart. The war ended. The convoys stopped. The submarines went back to Germany or were scuttled in deep water. The Norwegian coast became Norwegian again. The stone hut where I spent those frozen months probably doesn't exist anymore, reclaimed by weather and time, but I'm still there, in a way. Part of me never left. Part of me is always 24 years old, standing on that cliff in the Arctic darkness, watching the sea swallow ships and learning that some things you see, you carry forever. The ocean took sides. It sided with death and cold and the absolute mathematical certainty that metal will sink and flesh will freeze. And hope is just another word for the things we tell ourselves when we can't accept the truth. I saw it happen. I survived to tell about it. And now I've told it, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any witness can do. Survive long enough to remember, to speak, to make sure that what happened doesn't disappear into the same darkness that took those ships. Remember them. That's all I ask. Remember that they were here, that they fought and sailed and died in service of something larger than themselves, in waters that didn't care about their courage or their fear, or their last thoughts as the cold took them. Remember them, because I can't forget.